Hey guys, this is John, and I just returned from playing an over-the-board tournament. I was in Duluth, Minnesota, playing in the 2016 Twin Ports Open. This is the fifth year that they've had this tournament, and I'm happy to say I've played every single year. I know the organizers pretty well. They're friends of mine, Dane Zagar, Dane Matson, Dr. Oke Iwu, among others, and I'm always happy to come and support this tournament. And over the years, it has gotten stronger and stronger. And in fact, in the last couple years, they've had Grandmasters come and play. And in this year's edition, they had Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky, as well as Grandmaster Brian Smith in the field. And by rating, according to USCF ratings, I was the second seed. Alexander Yermolinsky was a little higher than me, and Brian Smith, even though his FIDE rating I think is slightly higher than mine, his USCF is a little lower. So I was smack in between those Grandmasters. So I'm going to go through my games from this tournament, and I'm probably going to make an abbreviated analysis. These will not be as long as my normal game analysis, just because I'm leaving out of town soon, so I'm a little bit pressed for time. So first round, I'm playing a player rated 1995. His name is Pratik Nehete, and this is a former student of mine, in fact. He's a high school-age kid, very nice kid, and good player, too. So I was black. He opened with e4, and I, of course, played the Scandi. Shout out to Team Scandi. Appreciate you all, you guys. So he took on d5, I took with the queen. And now Pratik played a line that I have previously commented on as being potentially problematic and underrated for white. So most people here just play knight c3 and chase the queen. And you'll know if you studied my repertoire on Chessable that I've been advocating queen d8 lately. I also play queen a5. Queen d6 is another option too. But the problem with knight c3, if there is one, I mean, it's hard to criticize a developing move with tempo. But the big issue for white is that it blocks the c2 pawn. So that pawn can be problematic for white going forward. And they have to know how to build their space advantage, even with the knight blocking the pawn. So the idea of knight f3, by contrast, is to try to build up a big pawn center without hindering the c pawn. So playing d4 and c4, and only then knight c3. So white wants to have it all in this line. And if black is not aware of what to do, black can easily wind up in a bad position. So this is the first round of the tournament, and it's game in 60, I should mention, for this single round. Game in 60 with a 30-second increment. And it's in the morning. I had just given a lecture the night prior on Friday night. So I wasn't in the mood for anything super sharp. The principled variation after knight f3 is bishop g4, pinning the knight, bishop e2, and now knight c6. And black intends to castle queenside should white try to establish the pawn on d4, bringing about maximum pressure on this point. We're going to have many pieces pointed at that d4 pawn. Possibly we'll even remove the knight, as happens in one of the main lines. However, this line can get extremely sharp, and given that this was a game 60, I'm playing a younger player, it's the first round of the tournament, I was really not in the mood for something sharp. So I ended up going with a line that, on Chessable, I say is an inferior variation, but I think it's decent as a one-off weapon, and still, white has to know what to do to properly get an advantage against it. That said, I wouldn't play this line against a very strong player or even in a much longer time control, because I think white has a chance to figure it out. So the variation I played is knight f6, so developing the king side instead. White plays d4. Now I pin the knight, bishop g4. Bishop e2, getting rid of the pin. And now e6. So what black intends to do is develop in a more sedate fashion than in that other line I showed you where black castles queenside and just tries to create all-out pressure against d4. So after e6, Pratik does the right thing. He castles. I play bishop e7. This is the proper square for the bishop in this line. Now white plays c4, and I retreat the queen to d8. This is probably the best square for the queen in this case. I don't think it makes sense to keep the queen more active like on f5. One problem if you play queen f5 is that white might go h3, and if ever you play bishop h5, you're subject to g4. So the queen is not extremely well placed unless black intends to take on f3, which doesn't make a lot of sense with the pawn on b7 under attack. White has a space edge and the two bishops. So queen to d8. Pratik plays knight c3. I castle. He plays bishop e3. This is a good square for the bishop. Alternatively, he could consider developing it to f4, but the extra protection of the d4 pawn makes sense for white. And in this line, black's going to put the knight on d7. Even though c6 is available, you don't often develop the knight to c6 in the Scandinavian. So knight b d7, on the other hand, keeps open the option of playing c5, which is one of black's primary means of counterplay in a middle game in this position. And here Pratik played queen b3, attacking my pawn on b7, and I replied with queen to c8. Okay, so roundabout here, I think, is where white should strive to get the bishop pair. They already have an advantage, but that advantage will be enhanced by gaining the two bishops. So which bishop are they going to hunt down? Of course, it's the light square bishop. So white can play here h3, and after either bishop h5 or bishop f5, try to secure the bishop. So if bishop f5, there's knight h4, and this bishop will be traded. If bishop g6, white can always take. And if bishop h5, on the other hand, white can, in fact, play g4, bishop g6, and then either knight h4 or maybe knight e5, even, if they don't mind a trade on e5. And I can tell you from experience, like the damage to white's king side is negligible. Black is not in a great position to take advantage of white's slightly weakened king. And you can see that I have a lot of my pieces on the 7th and the 8th ranks. So some players might be concerned about that, but in my opinion, this is the line of play that really casts doubt on black's entire setup with this knight f6, bishop g4, e6, bishop e7, castle's short line against knight f3. So black can, like I said, easily wind up in a very passive position, like something like this. Let's say rook fd1. The bishop can come to f3 to put pressure on the pawn on b7. Black has to be careful about how they open the position. It may not even make sense to open the position anymore because white has the bishop pair. And as I said, the damage to white's king is not going to be a big factor. So that's the secret to this position if you're playing it as white. So future opponents, if I play this line against you, please don't use this information against me. Just kidding. I probably have that coming if you do. This is actually published into my repertoire on chessable.com if you want to go take a look at that. So he should think about playing h3 and g4 roundabout here. But instead, Pratik played rook fd1, so just centralizing the rook. And I take the opportunity to play h6. This is specifically so that if white proceeds down this line, that my bishop always has a safe square to retreat to. So as soon as I was able to get h6 in, I felt more comfortable with the position. So Pratik plays rook ac1, really normal. And here I go a6. Kind of mysterious, right? Well, h6 I already told you the reason for. a6 is designed to control the b5 square. I alluded to the way black is trying to get counterplay in the middle game, which is pawn to c5, striking at that d4 pawn. And in many cases, you want the b5 square controlled. And this move proves to be particularly useful in the coming play. So a6. And here's where I think Pratik begins to make some mistakes. So white is slightly better here. It's not a gigantic advantage, but it's one that he can nurse and try to increase. And I think he should go about it in a similar way to where I was mentioning hunting down the bishop pair. So maybe playing h3 to start. That's just almost a free move for white because I'm not thrilled to take on f3 and give up my bishop. So say I play, probably in this case I would play bishop f5 to try to control this diagonal. Maybe jump the knight into e5 now. And this could be a good way to further capitalize on white's play. Then the bishop is cleared to go to f3. That will always tie me down. If there's a trade and then knight d7, white can always support this pawn with f4. And if we flick on the computer, I have a feeling white should be a little bit better here. You can see it's not a gigantic advantage, but it's an appreciable, nearly half pawn advantage just due to the space. So I believe that's how white should play. However, Pratik was probably thinking, I've got these great centralized pieces. My rooks are on files that are likely to become open right behind my advanced pawns. Minor pieces all in good positions. Even the queen is aggressive, pointing at b7. So if there's a time to open the position, maybe it's now. So he played d5, but as you'll see, black is well placed for this move. So after d5, I took on d5. He took with the pawn. Taking with the knight wouldn't change much. White could consider knight takes d5, knight takes d5, rook takes d5, but that's not really in the spirit of their d5 move. I would probably just play knight f6 here, establishing a connection between my queen and my bishop, gaining a tempo on the rook. And I don't think white's d5 push has accomplished much. So he takes with the c-pawn. Now white has an isolated pawn here, but he's hoping for play down the c-file in particular. And I have to be careful because anytime one of your opponent's rooks is lined up with your queen, you have to be vigilant about tactics that can come into play, even if there's pieces in between. Like as you see here, there's a knight on c3 and a pawn on c7, but that doesn't mean I can sleep on any tactics that are potentially occurring down the c-file. So I play bishop d6. And I like the bishop here. I think it's very well placed. It's influencing both wings from this square, and it's stopping pawn d6 from ever happening. White has an isolated d-pawn now, so they might be thinking about offloading that pawn in a bid to open lines. So we stop that. And now you can see the value of this a6 move on move 12. It stops knight b5. If that pawn were back on a7 and white could play knight b5 right here, that would be uncomfortable for me because they'd be hitting both d6 and c7. But as it stands now, I'm well fortified, and I think black is doing fine. I would prefer black slightly in this position, and that's the way I felt in the game too. So Pratik now plays h3. I don't want to swap my bishop for the knight unless there's a good reason to, so I play bishop f5, switching the diagonal of the bishop, but it looked pretty powerful on this long diagonal. And therefore Pratik decides to try to trade it off. He plays bishop to d3. I swap. And now I play rook e8. This is a nice, useful move to play, just putting my rook on an open file. I didn't see any opportunities jumping with the knight somewhere. I want my bishop to stay on d6. Pushing any pawns seems premature. So rook e8 is just a sensible move. And now he goes knight a4. This move in itself is not so bad, although I think the idea connected to this move is what proves to be white's downfall. So he's trying to introduce play down the c-file once again. Also, there's this idea of knight b6 in some cases, especially if this knight were to move from d7, then knight to b6 would be winning in exchange, right? Because unless I want to give up my queen, c takes b6, rook takes c8. So I have to be aware of tactics there. But it does put a knight on the side of the board, and unless that knight specifically does something in the next few moves, I'm skeptical of white's arrangement. So I decide to play knight e4, which takes advantage of white's last move. The knight is no longer standing on c3, so our knight is clear to go into this square. And in playing that move, I also enhance my control over c5. And I even have something of a threat here. I was thinking I might play b5, try to drive the knight back to c3, and then play knight c5, forking the queen and the rook. That may not work perfectly as planned. Like let's just say white plays some random move. I know they wouldn't play king f1, but if b5, I guess white could always play knight b6 and still maintain control over the c5 square, but this is kind of uncomfortable for white. I don't think the bishop is going to be a stellar piece on b6. I might even have some tactics related to this. I don't know. But the main thread was if the knight goes back to c3, I could try to introduce this idea and fork the queen and the rook. So therefore, Pratik decides to try to trade the knight on e4. So he plays knight d2, but this is a mistake. I think the computer was advocating rook d to d1 at this point, just retreating with this rook, removing any fork potential on c5. But knight d2, while logical appearing, has a problem. So now I play b5. So striking at the knight. And after b5, he decides to take on e4. Note again, if the knight moves back to c3, we have the same tactic. Knight b6 is probably bad for similar reasons to what I mentioned a moment ago. After take and take, I'm just skeptical of white's position. I'm trying to think if there's a specific tactic I had in mind during the game. Don't know if there is. But let's say I trade here. Bishop f4 is kind of tempting, but white can just come back. I could always just move my queen and be fine. I could even move my queen without trading the knights. Let's just put the engine on and see, just for kicks, what it says. It says queen f5, an aggressive move. Yeah, this threatens the bishop, and I would assume bishop takes c7 is just out of the question. Yeah, queen takes f2, and white's going to get killed. So that's why he didn't want to move the knight. So he takes on e4, and I cannot take on a4. B takes a4, an in-between move, because he does have simply queen takes back here, which should be completely fine for him, securing the knight. So I just recapture. After knight takes e4, I play rook takes e4 myself. And now knight into c5. And here is basically the culmination of the game, because after I play my next combination, white has very little chance and is probably just losing. And I know on Lichess it gives you the moves on the side, so I was going to pause and ask you what to do, but that seems kind of pointless now because you probably already peeked. But aside from the game continuation, try to identify another way for black to win material from this position. So there's two ways to win material for black from here. See if you can identify them both. And you can pause your video if you like. Okay, so one way is the one that I did in the game, and I think it is the best way, which is just rook takes e3. So temporarily giving up my rook for the bishop, but after white takes back, then I can take the knight on c5, just removing the defender. A pure removal of the defender tactic. And I've gained 2 minor pieces for a rook. Not bad, 1 point of material. Note that after rook takes e3, white cannot respond with knight takes d7, an in-between move, because of rook takes d3. And I'm on his queen, so he would have to take it. And after this, black is up an entire bishop. So rook takes e3, pretty straightforward tactic. I think Pratik just missed it. He told me after the game that he just completely blanked on this move. The other line, which I actually spent some time thinking about because I was comparing it with rook takes e3, is to play bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now rook c4. So kudos to you if you spotted this, because this is kind of a neat tactic. And the idea is that we're interfering with white's defense of the bishop on c5, so now I'm threatening, in addition to the rook on c1, also knight takes c5. And if white tries to deal with both of the problems with bishop e3, then I have rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, knight c5 with the fork. And again, I'll go up the exchange. The reason why I rejected it is that white could play, and he probably would play, rook takes c4 here, b takes c4, queen takes c4, and I still do get knight e5 in. However, after queen d4, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, we reach a position where, again, I'm up 1 point of material, but the position has been somewhat simplified. And I thought this position would be harder to win than the one I had in the game with the 2 minor pieces. It just felt that way to me. It's a little hard to explain why, but I thought that with my weak pawns, c7 and a6, it wouldn't be a simple matter to win the game without like dropping one of those pawns or giving one of them up. And I got to be careful about that because white does have the a and the b pawns. Also, the queen and the bishop might be able to combine and create some threats. With less pieces on the board, my king is potentially less safe. Whereas with the game line, I knew there were so many pieces on board that I could probably easily outplay white from here. So just an interesting judgment call. But again, congratulations if you saw both those lines, because I think bishop takes c5 and rook c4 is not too obvious. And by the way, in this position after rook takes e4, Pratik should definitely play knight c3. And I was thinking after that, rook b4, queen c2, and maybe knight e5, jumping up and attacking the rook and priming knight c4. Black has a lot of activity here, so I would have been happy. But this is better than what happened in the game. So going back to the game continuation, rook takes e3, rook takes e3, bishop takes c5. I could also take with the knight, but I thought my bishop capturing and gaining a tempo on the rook was fine. He moved rook f3, and I stick the bishop right back on d6. I was very happy with that square, so I decided to do that. This also prepares knight e5, whereupon my bishop on c5 would not be hanging. So he goes rook e1. I play knight e5 as advertised. He plays rook e3, and now I activate my queen. And it's just so tough for white in this position because they really have nothing to attack. Again, the material advantage is slim, but that's what it boils down to. White has nothing to attack. As long as I, as black, just parry any threats white comes up with, I will win this game based on the 2 minor pieces. In the long run, I'd love to win d5. That's a difficult pawn for white to defend. But for now, I was just being patient. So he goes queen c3, attacking the knight on e5. I jump into c4. I didn't think it was necessary to play a move like rook e8 and put myself in a pin. So knight c4, go and attack the rook. Also uncover the attack on d5. And he actually just gives me that pawn. So he plays rook f3, allowing takes. I mean, rook d3 is probably not much of an improvement. In fact, I think that runs into bishop b4. You can already see the coordination issues white has. And if queen takes b4, queen takes d3 is the point. So the wheels are quickly coming off for white. Rook f3, queen takes d5. He plays b3, so now I'm up 2 points of material. I drop my knight back to e5. Rook g3. And here I didn't see any immediate discovery against the rook on g3 that's any good. And note that I do have to be careful where I move the knight, if I move the knight at all, because of queen takes g7 mate. So I just thought, I haven't moved my rook yet. It's moved 29. I'm up 2 points of material. There's no rush in this position. Let's just play a useful move. So rook d8. Again, I'm not going to put my rook in a pin on e8, so I'll just put it on this square instead. Now he goes queen e3. So this creates the threat of queen takes h6. Although it's debatable if that's really a threat because, I don't know, let's say black plays something and queen takes h6 occurs. There is knight f3 check, which is a nifty move. And if rook takes f3, I can take the queen. If g takes f3, I can take on g3 and remove the defender. So it's probably not quite accurate to call queen e3 a threatening move, but I do have to keep in mind that the pawn on h6 could be captured. I just decided to play my knight back to g6, attacking the rook and covering any g-file threats. Pratik plays rook g4. I go harass his queen, bishop to c5, queen to g3. Now, when you're up material and queens are on board, oftentimes the easiest way to secure your advantage is to offer a queen trade or try to force a queen trade. Because without the queens, your king is usually going to be extremely safe. And that's about the only thing white could hope for here is mustering up some sort of attack against my king. And I know it's unlikely in this position. I don't think black has to worry about an attack too much, especially with my knight on g6. But still, I think getting the queens off the board is the most efficient way to win. So I played queen to d6 here, offering the trade. And I calculated that if queen f3, there is knight e5, so forking the queen and the rook. And also if queen to c3, I have queen to d2. So attacking the queen and also the rook on e1. My bishop is hanging in this case, but it doesn't matter because I would take on e1 with check. I did see that if check here, I think I can just play... Yeah, I think I can just play king h7 is what I looked at in the game. And it's a little weird, like I have 3 pieces under attack, but white can't favorably take any of them. If rook takes d8, I take their queen. If queen takes c5, I take their rook. And if queen takes d2, we get the preferred trade. And also my rook is very nice on the second rank, attacking f2 and a2. King is very safe. So queen d6 is basically forcing a trade. Note that f4 is illegal because of the bishop on c5. No other good squares for white to go to that are safe with his queen. So he took. I took with the bishop. Again, going back to that stabilizing square. He played rook e4. And you can afford to be patient if you're ahead the 2 points in material at this point. There's no extra glory for converting the position quickly. So I just decided to play king f8, covering the e8 square. No rook e8 check ever possible. Pratik goes a4. I played f5 now, knocking that rook off of its good e4 square. If rook e6, I was just going to play king f7. So he played his rook back to e3. And lots of ways black could play this. I just decided to play b4. I thought fixing this pawn on b3 as a weakness could be nice. And also I have the potential to use the c3 square for one of my pieces, maybe the knight in the future. So Pratik lashes out with g4. I think this decision probably accelerates white's defeat, but it's just not pretty. Yeah, again, there's nothing for white to do here. If something like rook f3, I can always play knight h4, attacking the rook and guarding f5. In the long run, I'd love to exchange one pair of rooks, so maybe I could think about playing like king f7, rook here, rook to e7, offering a trade. I can play knight e7 to d5 to c3 if I like. Many ways to go about winning this. Eventually, I'd like to create a pass pawn on the queen side. So g4, I decide to take on g4. He takes back with his h-pawn. And knight into f4. My knight is extremely well placed here. Can't be kicked away. He tries to pin it, but now he abandons his doubled rooks on the e-file, so I take that opportunity to offer that rook trade. And if white swaps, he's just done for, so he tries to avoid the trade. Threatening rook takes d6, removing the defender of the knight in the process. So I just support my knight even further. Nice outposted knight on f4. Now he plays rook d5, looking for rook to a5 and going after the a6 pawn. So white is striving to create targets and try to give me some headaches, but the problem here is he abandons the first rank. So rook e1 check, king h2. And now I'd love to do a discovery by moving this knight and delivering check, but I'm pinned right now, so I simply sidestepped with my king. So I played king to g8. Didn't want to go to the e-file, although I think almost any king move is decent here. I thought king g8 would actually shield my king from any future checks. And it's going to force the rook to move. So after he played rook a5, I calculated that I had knight g6 check. So discovery. King h3. If king g2, there's knight h4 check. Fork on the king and the rook. Game over. So king h3. And now knight h4. And this was the final move of the game. White resigned because not only is the rook attacked, but also he's faced with this almost unstoppable threat of rook to h1 checkmate. Yeah, I mean, you could throw in rook f8 check or something here, but yeah, it's game over at this point. So nice little mating net. King g7 I looked at for a second, but I rejected it because I thought white might be able to play rook f5. And then after knight g6 check, king h3, knight here, I saw he had rook f7, although I think this is very similar. White gets in one check, but he's done for after that. I like how the rook, the knight, and the bishop all combine to create this mating net with rook h1. So that's how the game ended up. First round victory in a g60. And I think this game demonstrates how you might be willing to play like a slightly suboptimal line in the interests of practical chess, basically. Like, I fully admit this knight f6 line is not as good as bishop g4, d4, knight c6, followed by castling queenside, but white has to know what to do to prove an advantage, and it gives black like a somewhat playable position. Against a good player, I would be much more concerned about this line. Not that Pratik isn't a good player, but I mean like a titled player, let's say. But he has to know some nuances, especially grabbing the bishop pair. I think that's the thing white should do in this line. As I mentioned, with h3, followed immediately by hunting down that light square bishop, or in the case of bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, knight h4, knight e5, one of the two. All right, hope you guys enjoyed this game analysis, and I was on 1 out of 1, and I'll be back very soon with analysis from round 2. Well, I probably shouldn't say very soon because I am in a time crunch, but we'll see when I get that video out. And, oh, by the way, I made a study for this game on Lichess. As you saw me entering in the arrows and stuff like that. It's probably not the greatest study, but I'll still throw up the link so you guys can go and play through this game. All right, guys, thanks a lot, and I will talk to you later. Bye.